Despite the widespread belief that her vision was unrealistic, she persisted in pursuing it. It was more significant to my parents than to me. Those who perished on the RMS Titanic in 1912 endured unimaginable grief for a long time afterward. After 53 years, one of the survivors who had seen the iceberg initially took his own life. A young girl cried herself to sleep for years. An actress wore the clothes she escaped in while filming a documentary about the accident, but she later discarded them. While some made it to stardom, others were mocked simply for having survived. While they emerged from the frigid Atlantic Ocean physically, their thoughts remained there indefinitely. This terrifying plot point was completely absent from Titanic. The ocean liner Titanic set sail on the icy night of April 14, 1912. Just before midnight, a watchman alerted the authorities after seeing something massive in the water. Ice composed it. The bridge officers attempted to redirect the ship, but it was already in reverse. The so-called unsinkable ship struck the iceberg's side precisely at 11:40 p.m. The ship was torn to shreds beneath the waves, despite the fact that it didn't feel particularly powerful, just an odd jar-like shaking. Almost immediately, the icy seawater began to pour in. At first, nobody gave it a second thought. Though the engines came to a halt, the individuals aboard remained motionless. It seemed like most people were either already asleep or were out having fun. People read or played cards to the cheerful accompaniment of the music. Molly Brown, a wealthy first-class passenger, was knocked to the floor by the shock, but she remained calm. It piqued the curiosity of some, and they even made fun of it. It was suggested that the two men, who were both dressed in silk pajamas, go swimming. Despite the steward's assurances that everything was fine, the truth was chillingly terrifying below deck. There was water seeping into 5 of the Titanic's previously watertight sections. In a flash, Edward Smith, the captain, knew the ship was doomed. Since then, a shift has taken place. Awakening the passengers and providing them with life jackets was initiated by the team. When the 20 lifeboats of the Titanic were located, no one was in them. There weren't enough for the more than 2,200 passengers. Even a bad situation would become tragic just because of this fact. The shock roused Ava Hart and her parents from their slumber when she was in the 2nd grade. No time wasted getting dressed. Going to the deck was her mom's order because she had a bad feeling about them. 3rd class was the worst. Many of them were stranded in a labyrinth of basement corridors and couldn't speak English. Not everyone made it out alive. The crew began lighting flares into the sky at 12/5 of an hour. Another ship was visible in the distance, but it remained silent the entire time. The SS Californian is believed by some to have been involved. It could have detected the flares but took no action. Quickly, the wireless operators on board the Titanic communicated with other ships in the area by sending out CQD and SOS messages. In the mailroom, individuals strove to rescue the mailbags as water level rose to their knees. The men in the engine rooms were responsible for maintaining power and lighting. They persisted despite knowing full well that they were doomed to failure. Many individuals on deck were unaware of just how dire the situation was. The lights were still turned on and the ship didn't appear to be leaning. Not all of the ladies were keen on going. Rather than get into the little wooden rowboat dangling over the murky water, the women clung tenaciously to their husbands. As time went on, more and more individuals started up. As the officer delicately guided the women to the boats, the young waitress Violet Jessup observed, "Some of the men silently retreated, having already decided they weren't going." Although not always flawlessly, people followed instructions to prioritize women and children. The first rowboat set sail at 12:30 in the morning. There were only 28 people inside, even though it could hold 65. A large number of early ships set sail with just 50% of their cargo. It was empty. All that was heard was uncertainty rather than shouting or haste. As the Titanic sank into the distance, Lawrence Beasley, seated in a rowboat, observed the event. Not a single soul moved. Silence fell. The ship was gorgeous at night, even though it was descending slowly. Rapidly, the atmosphere shifted from calm to anxious. No men were allowed to board the lifeboats by Charles Lightler, the second officer. Lightler shot an individual who attempted to gain access. Although the message was legible, it failed to load. In order to fill up his boats, First Officer Murdoch on the other ship allowed men to join if there were no women waiting. Joe was a member of that group. The company's boss, Bruce Ismay, was the owner. Despite his prior experience helping load boats, he stealthily stepped in just as Boat 16 was about to depart with only half of its cargo. Silence engulfed him. He pivoted and departed. In that instant, all he could do was watch the ship sink behind him. Later, harsh people would pass judgment on him. On decks, men assisted women in climbing steps. Despite knowing they would never see them again, some fathers kissed their children and spouses goodbye. In addition, the crew was preparing 2 additional lifeboats. These were foldable canvas ones that were barely seaworthy. Because they were stored atop the officers' rooms, assembling these boats required a human. The time was later than 2 in the afternoon. As water poured onto the deck, the crew struggled with the ropes. The ship started to lean more sharply just as Officer Littler and a few others had freed one of them. Inside the ship, things like chairs and dishes fell to pieces. The deck outside had become dangerously steep. Near the boat's rear were 17-year-old Jack and his companion Milton Long. All the boats had departed, leaving no other option. The 2 youths exchanged silent glances before leaping. In a subsequent piece, Jack revealed that they had doubts about their chances of success. The frigid Black Sea was their jumping-off point. Following a brief interval, at approximately 2:18 a.m., the Titanic's bow sunk to the ocean floor. Her rear end soared into the sky. Too much stress caused the ship to break in half. Even though British officials later claimed she was fine, there were witnesses who saw it happen. After remaining on the entire time, the lights finally went out. During the chaos, Chief Baker Charles remained positioned at the very bow of the vessel. In order to facilitate floating while indulging in whiskey, he tossed deck chairs into the water. As the ship descended vertically, he clung to the edge and rode it down like an elevator. By the time the ship reached the water, it was already dangerously cold. A police officer likened it to 1,000 stab wounds. Extremely chilly at 28 degrees was the water temperature. Jack was one of hundreds of people who had crowded into that water. Even with life vests, it was pointless. Their hearts would stop beating due to the cold in no time. By 2:20 a.m. the ship known as the Titanic had sunk. She became one with the sea. Those on board the lifeboats were in too much shock to do anything but observe. Lawrence Beasley reported that, while seated in Lifeboat 13, they could detect no sound. Screams followed, a sound that would stay with everyone forever. Hundreds of cries erupted simultaneously aboard Lifeboat 14. The young Ava Hart listened to everything. Hearing the cries was worse than seeing the ship go down. For over 30 minutes they continued. From across the water the cries resounded. The terrifying noise which Colonel Gracie recalled kept repeating, my God," before finally fading away. After that an icy stillness descended, as if it were an illusion. Ava Hart would always remember that moment. Time appeared to have halted, she remarked. The sky was still filled with stars, but the ground beneath them was devoid of any life. In the stillness and darkness of the ocean, more than 1,000 lives were lost. In the stillness of the night, the lifeboats made their way slowly across the icy Atlantic. Although 700 individuals disembarked from the Titanic and boarded 18 smaller vessels, it did not guarantee their safety. They were surrounded by ice fragments and the lifeless bodies of those who had perished in the water. Many people were sitting in close proximity to one another or practically alone on various lifeboats. They were mostly dressed in baggy clothing or nightgowns. Their jaws dropped, their hands went numb, and their eyes widened in shock. All they could do was wait for rescue or for the cold to put an end to the sinking, whichever came first. In Lifeboat 6, tensions were rising. The only crew member who was not well was Quartermaster Robert Hitchens. He wasn't issuing commands as the ship sailed away from the Titanic. Rather, he was instilling fear in the passengers. From across the water one could make out the sound of gunfire. According to some, the police were allegedly firing into the air in an effort to control the throngs. Next, a deafening screech sounded. The Titanic's boilers were bursting, according to Hitchens. He had no doubt that the ship would destroy everything in its path. The women surrounding him remained silent and gazed into the murky water. The unsinkable Molly Brown, whose real name was Margaret Brown, was never one to sit still though. She was exhausted. While others in the water continued to scream, Hitchens remained angry and refused to return to assist them. Brown grasped an oar. She was accompanied by a second female. Despite there being just one male and 14 females on board, they proceeded without inquiring. It was inevitable that someone would have to begin rowing, Brown later wrote. She even proposed returning to the area to search for additional survivors, attempting to guide them. They would only find jerks. Hitchens shot back. Later on, a violent altercation ensued. Despite Brown's best efforts, the boat was unable to turn around. That decision had been on her mind for some time. It was too late for her, despite her best efforts to lend a hand. What will remain of her is the way she maintained composure, challenged Hitchens, and stepped up when others faltered. Molly Brown never claimed to be a hero, and the night was long and chilly. On the other hand, she mustered up courage that night, along with very few others. Just one rowboat returned to the water to search for survivors. Harold Lowe was serving as the 5th officer in charge of Boat 4. Once he heard no more cries, he waited. He jumped in too soon, and people in need could have swarmed the boat. After he determined it was safe to do so, he transferred some survivors to other boats in the area, so he could return and aid even more people. In the total absence of light,
Lowe and his small crew paddled their way back to the debris. The icy water was rescued from some of the victims. It was a 4 or 5 person event. Feng Lang, a young man from China, was among them. He was discovered nearly frozen and clinging to a plank of wood. For a long time, no one remembered the 6 Chinese passengers who survived the ordeal. 2 foldable lifeboats floated nearby, clinging precariously to the water. Collapsible B had flipped over. The canvas ship had been turned over, and about 30 men were sitting on top of it. Among them were radio operator Harold Bride and the highest-ranking surviving officer, Charles Lightler. For hours they stood in water up to their ankles, relying on each other for support as they braved the darkness. It was a one-man show. Nearby, the Bride discovered a lifeless body. His colleague and the ship's primary radio operator, Jack Phillips, was the one who called. Phillips attempted to summon assistance by remaining behind and sending texts right up until the finish. He couldn't stand the chill. After the crisis passed, Bride whispered. He stood his ground until the crisis was over and then gave up. The second collapsible boat, Boat A, was partially submerged. Kate Gilna, a passenger in 3rd class, and a couple of men were admitted. At the break of dawn, 12 individuals remained alive. Overnight, the others had frozen. Out at sea, it was silent and dark. There was a separation between the lifeboats. In subsequent reports, several individuals described feeling as though they were adrift in an infinite sea, encircled only by specks of darkness. A number of lifeboats were equipped with lights per Captain Smith's instructions. It was sometime around 3:30 in the morning. A distant light on the horizon was noticed by someone. Swift assistance was on its way. By 4 a.m., the RMS Carpathia made her arrival at last. Throughout the night, it pushed its engines to their maximum capacity and traveled at a breakneck pace. Lifeboat 2's watcher, Frederick Fleet, who had seen the iceberg first, was among the first to perceive a glow. As the Carpathia drew near, he emitted a joyful scream. Standing there for hours in the dark, chilly and terrified, its lights appeared miraculous. At last there was assistance. Picking up lifeboats scattered over miles of frigid water, the Carpathia moved slowly. It took over 4 hours to go from one raft to another. Guests and crew members alike pitched in to help the frail and chilly survivors on board. To relocate some, they had to be hoisted off the ground. They merely stared or sobbed. Many were unable to speak at all. Babies were clung to by their mothers. The children wept for their deceased parents. Due to extreme fatigue and cold, several individuals fainted upon reaching the deck. A lot of people got blankets. Then came the time for hot beverages. Those who managed to stay alive gathered close, some trembling with fear, and others from sheer shock. On board the Titanic, Harold Bride worked as a wireless operator. He had to be transported to the ship's medical facility due to frostbite on his feet. He returned to his job as a wireless operator in Carpathia, despite the pain, and helped send out crucial texts. Some people were not as fortunate. Archibald Gracie, a first-class rider, was continually worse from exhaustion. The injuries he sustained that night proved fatal after only 8 months. Tragic events unfolded on all 3 levels. Jack, who was 17 years old, sought out his folks. Well, he had succeeded. His father was absent, but his mother had already departed. Standing alone were 2 small boys, no more than 4 and 2 years old. Their rightful owner did not appear. Although their father lost his life, he spared their lives by putting them on a rowboat. French was the only language the lads knew, well, at least until their mom could be located. Because Margaret Hayes could communicate with them in their language, a kind woman took them in. Concurrently, Carpathians donated their own bedrooms and any clothing they had. Among the women who did more than just lend a hand, Molly Brown took the lead. She organized a group of survivors, solicited donations for those who had suffered catastrophic losses, and bestowed medals upon the Carpathia crew. Working alone, White Star Line employee Bruce Ismay sought refuge in a doctor's office. He sobbed uncontrollably because he was so crushed. The once confident man was overcome with emotion as he broke the news of Titanic's sinking to his colleagues. By 9 a.m., the area surrounding the Titanic's sinking was serene once more, with the sole presence of floating debris and perilous ice. After a brief prayer session, the Carpathia's captain directed the ship towards New York. You'll need an additional 58 hours to reach your destination. He left before he could collect bodies. Different vessels could handle that terrible task. It killed 706. Death toll on board was over double what it should have been. There was an overwhelming sense of loss. People did nothing more than sit and gaze at the water. A few individuals sobbed softly. Not everyone could bring themselves to speak. As a young girl named Ava Hart recalls, her mother sobbed uncontrollably upon learning that her husband was departing and would never return. No one could get any rest, even the living. Nightmares that replayed every sound and scream kept them awake. The Carpathia arrived in New York on April 18th at long last. The gray sky let loose a shower of rain as she sailed past the Statue of Liberty. Those who had hoped to arrive joyful found the sight nearly overwhelming. At the docks there were many people. Numerous journalists ascended upon the vessel. At the head of the line were the lifeboats. Quiet and haunting, they served as constant reminders of the past. Afterwards, the remaining individuals made their appearance. They had to transfer some of them using stretchers. Off the steerage were escorted the first and second class passengers. Class divisions emerged once again among the survivors. Food and warm clothing were prepared by Red Cross and Women's Aid Group volunteers. Everyone was curious. Questions abound for those who managed to escape. Not everyone responded. Although they made an effort to communicate verbally, their expression spoke volumes. When the Titanic went down, most people assumed the worst had passed for the survivors. However, for a great number of the survivors, that icy night marked the beginning of a far more protracted ordeal. Not only did they have to deal with the aftermath of what happened, but they also had to deal with how others perceived them. Heroism was bestowed upon a select few. Some were branded as naive. Guilt followed some individuals until the end. A.J. Bruce Ismay, one of the ship's most crucial men, managed to escape unharmed. Still, news outlets kept covering the story. As innocent women and children perished, he committed the crime of sneaking into a rowboat. Newspapers used derogatory illustrations to mock him. During the formal investigation, he was interrogated as if he were facing a murder trial. Despite his assurances that there were no women in sight, nobody paid attention when he boarded the final foldable boat. A sense of humiliation shattered him. He left his job and spent the remainder of his life in seclusion in the Irish countryside. His sleep was disturbed by the thoughts of others, and perhaps by what he witnessed that fateful night. Spokesman for Service and Peace was Second Officer Charles Littler. He did everything he could to help load lifeboats, and clung desperately to a foldable raft. He was a hero on the outside, and he saved lives at Dunkirk during World War I. On the inside, though, he changed constantly. Being the highest-ranking officer to ever live caused him immense guilt. In order to save face for the crew and the company, he fabricated evidence during official investigations. The fact that the ship had sunk in 2 places is one example he overlooked. In quiet moments, he battled the voices that tried to drown out his thoughts. Being alive was seen as a failure by many men. Even though he survived on a sinking lifeboat, the loss of his loved ones broke the spirit of the esteemed Colonel Archibald Gracie. He spent months before his death writing about the accident, painstakingly trying to capture every detail. After enduring a few months of illness and depression, he passed away. His final remarks were uttered as he pondered the sinking. The lifeboat they managed to escape in had a passenger capacity of 40, but there were only 12 on board. I was suspicious just because of that fact. It was later revealed that Sir Cosmo had allegedly paid the crew not to search for survivors when they returned to the water. He informed them that he had provided £5 to compensate for their belongings. However, it was irrelevant. A lot of people started to hate them. Many felt they prioritized financial gain over human life. The media dubbed their escape attempt the money boat, despite the fact that they were cleared of all charges. They had their honors tarnished. People were blaming Lady Duff Gordon for doing nothing more than protecting herself, she once said. Not all survivors were famous or wealthy enough to afford protection. They were mostly undocumented immigrants seeking a fresh start in the United States. Home, clothing, and finances were all snatched from many. From White Star Line they heard very little. Charity helped a little, but the pain outweighed the loss of possessions. No one spoke about being hurt or treated unfairly in 1912. The living were expected to proceed, but they failed to do so. As a little girl of 7 years old, Ava Hart's parents boarded the RMS Titanic. Although she and her mother survived, her father did not. The incessant screaming kept Ava from getting a good night's rest for a long time. She kept hearing the same sounds from that night. It wasn't until she was in her 20s that she forced herself to go on a cruise, conquering her fear of the ocean. The dreams began to improve after that. Afterwards, she denounced the arrogance that led to the accident. The worst tragedy was sailing with only 800 lifeboats when there were over 200 people on board, according to her. It is said that some of the survivors never got better. Robert Hitchens, who was angry during the escape and helped row a lifeboat, was slandered. He became enraged by how people remembered him after they fought with him on the bus. He felt as if the Titanic were a ghost chasing after him. He served time for an attempted murder conviction in the 1930s. Still haunted by that icy April night, he passed away impoverished. The iceberg was first noticed by the watch Frederick Fleet. When he finally managed to get the alarm that would have rescued them, it was already too late. After surviving, he returned to sea, served in the war, and eventually had to sell newspapers to support himself. The loss of his wife and home shattered him on a deep level. In 1965, he committed suicide in a peaceful yard. His age was 77. Some think he will never be able to forgive himself for being too late to see the iceberg. However, he wasn't actually at fault. Margaret Brown was the type of person who refused to allow adversity shape who they were. She could have capitalized on her fame for personal gain, but she chose to dedicate her fame to helping others. She cared for wounded soldiers, helped rebuild France, and even ran for U.S. Senate. Others came up with the name Unsinkable Molly Brown, not her. Following the Titanic, she made no effort to become famous. Simply put, she was the type of woman who could write to her daughter, "I am sick at heart but alive and safe." Even though she was sad, she stood firm. Violet Jessup was one of the subsequent groups. It may sound like something out of a book, but her story was actually true. 3 major shipwrecks passed through her life.
To start, she was on board when the Olympic collided with another vessel. She was subsequently ushered into Lifeboat 16, while aboard the Titanic. Last but not least, she was aboard the Britannic when the warship struck a mine and went down. She leaped from the boat, was swallowed whole, and struck her skull on the keel, yet she managed to survive. An old fracture in her skull was later discovered by the doctors. After her near-death experience, it was the sole thing she managed to preserve. Despite everything, she persisted. Returning to the ships was her initial job. The rumor mill had her named Miss Unsinkable. The fact that she passed away at the age of 84 demonstrates that some people are simply physically different. Out of her suffering, Dorothy Gibson sought to create art. When she survived the shipwreck, she was just a young actress. Just a short time later, she was back in her hiding clothes, filming a documentary about it. However, pretending to endure the traumatic experience crushed her. She permanently faded from public view after suffering a nervous breakdown. Then, during Deus Dui, she was imprisoned in Italy. Her tale bore the shadow of the Titanic, like an unhealed wound, even though she lived to tell it again. Parties weren't thrown for all survivors. Unbeknownst to Masabumi Hosono, a Japanese tourist, a lifeboat was nearly within his reach. He almost didn't. Attempts were made by the crew to subdue him and bring him back below deck. He was on the verge of death when he overheard a police officer yelling that 2 spots remained. An individual leaped. After a brief pause, Hosono pursued it. His heart would break at the prospect of never seeing his wife and children again, he wrote afterwards. However, Japan held the opposite view. The news reported that he was foolish. Nobody at home ever brought up Titanic again. He was unpopular, and he lost his job. In the 1990s, his letters were made public, and people finally realized he hadn't lied or hidden anything. Despite his best efforts to assist others on the rowboat, he was already crippled by shame. Despite his survival, he was never truly granted permission to live. Those 6 Chinese men who managed to escape alive were even less famous. No tourists or super wealthy individuals were among those on board. The workers were en route to Cuba. It became a makeshift lifeboat, as others clung to the debris. Although they were rescued, they were not desired. The purpose of the Chinese Exclusion Act was to guarantee that they were returned without delay. The stories they had shared were erased. Worse, racist rumors circulated in the press for years, claiming they were either hiding or posing as women. Spots were not pilfered. In no way did they cheat. However, they were still held accountable. Due to their constant migration from one nation to another, and from one job to another, they were never able to truly settle down. People are starting to remember their names now. Some, though, had to fight for the lives of others, just to stay alive. It was only at the age of 22 that Elsie Bowerman and Molly Brown escaped in the identical rowboat. But she wasn't fading into the background. She witnessed the Russian Revolution firsthand while serving as a nurse in World War I. Soon after the war ended, she made history as one of the first female lawyers in Britain. Then she went on to influence UN initiatives pertaining to women's rights. It became a mission for her to stay alive, not merely a fortunate accident. Next came the children. In a custody battle, the Navratil brothers' father gave them fictitious names to use while they were on the run. The boys survived the sinking and eventually found their mother, but he did not. Up until 2001, the younger Michel was a professor. For the rest of his life he felt the weight of being the Titanic's orphan. Lillian Asplund passed away when it was just 5 years old. Death befell her father and 3 brothers. Most of her life after that she remained silent. In her mother and brother's household, she resided. She was one of the final witnesses that fateful night before she passed away in 2006. Milvina Dean, the youngest, was born 9 weeks premature. Although she had no recollection of the sinking, it came to symbolize her subsequent experiences. She went so far as to speak at funerals and sell Titanic artifacts to cover the costs of her nursing home. She received financial support from James Cameron and Leonardo DiCaprio. She passed away in 2009, bringing an end to the tale of the final living survivors of the Titanic. More than simply existing, these individuals shared something in common. What came next required them to do this. Some people finally came up with an explanation. Pain was carried by some. Being alive was enough to inflict pain on some. But their lives took on a second, more subdued narrative about resilience in the face of tragedy and the meaning of perseverance.